Good morning, good morning, good morning. Robert Scribbler here, and welcome to a special session of the OBX Wave Report. I am hearkening back to a previous special edition where I talked about how thermodynamics says the fossil fuel industry is effed, and this, of course, this was a discussion of the harm caused by fossil fuel burning, as well as the benefits provided by clean energy, and just talking about how clean energy generally is superior to fossil fuels, and it's kind of getting to be at this point, standing against clean energy is like it provides so many obvious benefits that it's almost like shooting yourself in the foot, or um, deciding not to eat vegetables if vegetables tasted like, chocolate. Um, but one of the things that I did do, which is kind of ironic, is I took a tweet by Professor Terry Hughes where he was retweeting a another professor in mathematics, who was talking about the excess heat in the northern hemisphere and how that excess heat has loaded the atmosphere with moisture. And right now, also highlighting an atmospheric river pointing toward California. And California is, now under the gun for severe weather. What I did not know is that Eliot Jacobson, and I never really met him before, online or elsewhere, is a proponent of doomist memes, climate doom memes. And so, full confession here, I did not do all my research on Eliot Jacobson before I posted the retweet by Terry Hughes. I was simply trying to amplify Terry Hughes's message, and I think looking back, I probably would have chosen a different messenger for the atmospheric moisture loading if I had dug into Eliot Jacobson's communications. And why is this? It's because climate doom is a harmful form of messaging, and I find it to be a combination of things. And you know what I'm going to do? I'm going to go back. I'm going to go back in time into the Wayback Machine, and I'm going to dial the clock back to 2012, back to when I was writing a climate blog. And mainly what those of us who were promoting climate action were dealing with was this issue of climate change denial, and and a coordinate clean energy denial as well. So, and climate change denial at the time was highlighting a non-fact. The climate change deniers were saying that the world had stopped warming. And they do this every so often, especially when there's like a long, period of La Nina, this period of natural variability where um, La Nina cools the atmosphere even as the oceans take up a lot of heat. And so there were a lot of climate change deniers that were hyper focused on that particular element. And then generally, there were also a group of what I consider to be kind of lukewarmers who were just basically saying, oh, well, climate change is not that big of a deal. And so the messaging among activists for action on climate, and from my point of view, looking at risk, was to highlight the fact that climate change is really bad. And if you let it get out of hand, it'll really wreck your day. And so as I started focusing on things like 10% scenarios and things that, could happen that were really bad, like looking at the science and focusing on things like, actually, you know what, I'm not going to get into specifics because I don't want to amplify a climate doom message, but um, but looking at like the worst case scenarios for climate change, not the inevitable, not the likely scenarios, but the worst case, like the 10% or worse, the kind of things that could happen, though unlikely, that could really wreck things. And and the reason why I was looking at it was for a totally different reason than what would later be the climate doomers were looking at it. I was looking at it for the purpose of saying, hey, you know, even if this scenario is an unlikely scenario, do we want to even risk it, right? So if there's like a 10% chance of something that could really put human civilization, on the back foot, um, if you keep burning fossil fuels, say to the point where you get 3 degrees Celsius warming or 4 degrees Celsius warming globally, or 6 degrees Celsius, or God forbid 9. Um, we don't want to tempt fate. We don't want to ruin the life support systems completely, of the wonderful world that we now share, right? So that's the message. That was the message. That was like, okay, these are the really bad things. Let's look at this for a second, and not let's not go crazy about it, but let's just say, look, we don't want to take that risk. Our children are too important. Our lives are too important. Even if it's an outside risk, we don't want to take it. And so, therefore, inject increased urgency into the need to mass deploy clean energy and tamp back the climate crisis, right? But what happened, and I didn't really talk about this because I did not want to amplify the messaging of Guy McPherson, for example. Um, and looking back, I believe this was a mistake. I should have talked about it directly, immediately, when it happened, and so that's partly on me. But and of course, I'm not, like, I mean, they're like heavy hitters, like Dr. Mann and Catherine Hayhoe and all these others who've been around the block a number of times. So me myself, I was just delving into risk, but I'm not a climate scientist, right? So, but what happened is as I started to report on these issues, um, a doomer, and this was my first experience of climate doom, by the name of Guy McPherson started to take my post out of context and say that because of this, because of this analysis of a 10% scenario, the world is going to, civilization is going to end. Civilization is going to end in like the 2030s. And and to be crystal clear, what I was talking about was that we would likely see increased pressure of civilization collapse, particularly for certain nations around the world in the 2030s timeframe, if we kept burning fossil fuels on what is talked about as a business as usual scenario, which is pretty much burn all the fossil fuels that you can extract and don't mitigate, don't really deploy clean energy, at least rapidly. And thankfully, we're not on a business as usual track anymore. We've gotten to the point where we've tamped down the warming for this century already by the policies that are in place. And it's not to say that for this century, um, if we don't continue to double down on the efforts for clean energy, it's not to say that we wouldn't have bad impacts. But we're not on that business as usual scenario, which is the kind of a near worst case scenario. And now many climate scientists are saying that business as usual is not really a viable scenario right now, because of the strength of the response coming from clean energy and and other measures. So so like to get back to the circle here, um, so Guy McPherson was taking something that I said out of context and then amplifying it and saying, okay, we're doomed. And basically, and also arguing, saying that there's no point to act that it's hopeless, that and the underlying message being that humankind is awful, terrible, evil, kind of deserves what's going to happen, and we should just give up. And this was a very nihilistic kind of message, and it put me on the back heel. Uh, it was hard for me to grapple with the darkness of the message, the despair, the depression, the nihilism, the loathing, the inherent loathing. I don't know if it was like kind of self-loathing or just loathing of humans in general in a misanthropic kind of way. Um, but it was dark beyond dark, and and it was at this point that I just started saying, hey, this is doom. Talk about in the forums on my blog. I'd be like, hey, this is doom. Don't listen to it. It's bad. Um, but I don't think I came out strongly enough against it in a messaging standpoint. So I'm going to do it now, and I'm going to retract my support of Eliot Jacobson. I've looked through his tweets, and it appears to me that he promotes a message of climate doom. If Eliot believes that he does not promote a message of inevitable civilization collapse and that action on climate is hopeless, these are both fallacies, these are both lies. If he does not, I invite him to correct the record and to make a statement saying that he does not believe in inevitability or doom when it comes to climate. Um, but this is what I believe his messaging promotes based on what I've seen. And so I'm not going to endorse Eliot Jacobson so long as he promotes a message of climate doom. If my interpretation of this is incorrect, um, then I will apologize in advance. But I've looked at Eliot's Twitter feed, and I'm just going to say I'm sorry, Eliot. I can't promote you at this time. All right, so let's get into doom, um, and I want to talk about doom because I think it's kind of like another form of response to climate change. That's it's like climate change denial. I think it's a form of climate change denial. Some of the climate scientists have said it is, and I agree with this. And we're going to start out with Dr. Michael Mann, who's a major communicator on the issue of climate. His communications are spot on, in my opinion. I wholeheartedly support his messaging. And we'll just start out with this quote. We don't need climate doom porn. The truth is bad enough as it is. December 20th, 21. And this is a fact. I think that, I've talked about the nihilism and the misanthropy of climate doom and just the lies. But what I think doom porn is yet again another abdication of action. There's this sense, this response whenever you talk about climate that, oftentimes people kind of feel like the issue is too big. What can I do? Um, and and generally, when you look at the problem of climate change, you can kind of get stuck in that rut. And then the reactions that can kind of grow up out of that are like, okay, it's so big, I can't do anything. Uh, and then the doom reaction kind of is, oh, well, then it must be inevitable since I can't do anything. But the fact is that each of us can do something. Um, and and then when it comes to doom porn, it's kind of this hyper focus on the train wreck. It's like, okay, um, there's this, you know, there's this if it bleeds, it leads element of news, and there's something in us that focuses in on the awful and the horrible because it's a mystery. It's fascinating. We have this innate sense of comfort, and yet when that is challenged, that's like a mystery to us, you know. So when the stability of our worlds is challenged, and something terrible happens, especially if it's over there, if it's not like happening to us, the the mind can kind of glom onto that as kind of a spectacle. Um, and that's what doom porn has become. It's this telling of lies of a spectacle of, kind of an apocalypse that is inevitable and abdicating responsibility to act to prevent that harm. So I want to focus in on this quote by Dr. Michael Mann. And then I also want to talk about climate doom because it's a big deal now. It's not just, at the margins. It's not just Guy McPherson. It's freaking TikTok and, all these other places that are now spouting messages of climate doom. And I think that there's both a human reaction in the sense of, people thinking, okay, we can't do anything, so kind of getting on the bandwagon of helplessness and just lack of courage when it comes to fighting climate change, um, and then glomming onto the spectacle. And so I do want to read this quote from BBC News, and I'm just going to I want you to read this article by BBC News if you get a chance. It's why is climate doomism going viral and who's fighting it? It's a good article, a good basic introduction to climate doomism. There's other exposés now out there on climate doomism. I would particularly invite you to check out Dr. Michael Mann and Dr. Catherine Hayhoe on the issue of climate doomism, and particularly the recent publications by Dr. Michael Mann. But I want to read this quote for you guys. Climate doomers believe the world has already lost the battle against global warming. That's wrong. And while that view is spreading online, there are others who are fighting the viral tide. And I've highlighted some of those, and I want to reinforce the message of those who are fighting doom. And I also want to say that as someone who has looked at risk, for me, the fear of climate change has fallen off. I am not as freaked out by climate change as I was in 2012, back when we weren't really on the mass deploy clean energy ramp. I feel much more confident now that we can avoid the 10% scenarios and even avoid the bad effects that aren't the 10% scenarios, which are bad enough. I think, and I agree with Dr. Michael Mann, the scientist. And the other scientists are saying we still have a pathway to 1.5 degrees Celsius or less. And I think that the human spirit of innovation can get us to net zero carbon emissions faster than we expect and get us to net negative carbon emissions faster than we expect, as long as we put our effort and focus there. So I've got hope, and it's a growing hope. So it's ironic that me, someone who looks at risk, is looking at this rising tide of doomism because I feel more confident now, looking at risk. And I don't want to put words in the climate scientist's mouth, but the messaging that I'm seeing from scientists on clean energy also seems more hopeful than it did even just 5 years ago. So hopeful, so long as we continue to act. And as Dr. Michael Mann says, use our agency with urgency. So, all right. Now, I did talk about Professor Eliot Jacobson. I'm going to go ahead and unfollow him. And I'm going to leave an opportunity for him to retract his doomist statements, um, and to acknowledge the fact that we do have climate hope and that we can mass deploy clean energy. And I encourage him to do so. And then I do want to round out this conversation with Terry Hughes here, who is an expert on coral reefs. And so Terry retweeted Professor Eliot, which is how I ran into Professor Eliot Jacobson. And 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 what Terry did was completely above the board. I mean, the post that Eliot Jacobson tweeted was a fact, and this is one of the nuances of climate doom and just the climate discussion that I think we need to talk about as we talk about climate doom. There are facts about the climate system that climate doomers talk about. And one of the facts is that as the Earth warms, the atmospheric moisture loading increases, and you can see extreme precipitation events. Um, but and there's a cycle that as the atmosphere warms, you get faster evaporation, which enhances droughts, and it enhances the other side of the hydrological scale as well. It enhances extreme rainfall events. This is just a scientific fact. And this is the reason why I kind of glommed onto the tweet by Professor Eliot Jacobson. Is he was posting a fact that was relevant to what was happening in California, or what is happening in California right now with the atmospheric river pointed toward California, which likely has a climate crisis fingerprint on it. So that's how I kind of got sucked into promoting a person who has doomist messages, and it's a part of the understanding the nuances of climate that's critical here. We need to understand the relationship between the risk and the harm coming from fossil fuel burning and the hope coming from clean energy. And so when we broaden our context, we have a better understanding. And so doomism hyper focuses on risk and then ends up twisting facts to kind of reinforce this view of inevitability when it comes to risk and harm, as opposed to focusing on action. And so I did want to talk a little bit about how I ended up getting sucked in to promoting someone who based on what I'm looking at now looks like he promotes a doomist message. And it's by not broadening the context, right? I did not go to the page, the feed of Eliot Jacobson and look at his broader messaging, and I did not, in my opinion, fully consider the broader context there. So I encourage the climate communicators to be also on point when it comes to this, to not unintentionally amplify the messages of climate doomers. Even though some of what they say is true, the broader messaging is false. And that messaging is, the false message is that we can't act on climate. We're inevitably doomed. Um, there's a sixth mass extinction that is unstoppable. Human civilization will collapse, and that is false. We can act on climate change. We have the clean energy technologies and the sustainability methods and technologies to bring the world to net zero carbon emission and net negative carbon emission. And if we focus our energies there, it'll happen faster than expected. So thank you for joining me for this special session of the OBX Wave Report, where I call out climate doom for what it is, where I hold myself accountable for my previous messaging in an unintentional mistake, and I retract my support. unintending as it was, of a proponent of climate doom, and where we look to hope, where we look to the fact that clean energy can bring us out of the climate crisis if we focus our efforts there. So thank you for joining me again. I really appreciate you all, and please do your best to help mass deploy clean energy and save so many of the good and vital aspects of our world, like the coral reefs that Terry Hughes loves so much. So thank you once again.